You know, over the past decade or so, the Dreamcast has become what is known at this time as an internet legend. Most people now look back on retro games with nostalgia and realize how forward-thinking the Dreamcast was when it came out. Not so much at that time. If you were around and gaming at the time, you understand that the PS2 was coming out and really put a damper on the Dreamcast and Sega's party at the time, with promises of DVD compatibility and next-gen visuals, although people still to this day argue Dreamcast versus PS2, but that's a whole nother topic. In this case, though, the Dreamcast was very forward-thinking. It introduced things like modems to online gaming when it came with it. They tried to make it as mainstream as possible to go online with the system, full VGA output, in a time when interlaced was considered fine. I mean, the PS2 was interlaced when it came out with composite, as well as pretty much any other system at the time. So it was interesting to see Sega really take these shots and these chances with the Dreamcast. The list goes on for things like peripherals that they attempted, the fishing rod, the gun con being really a mainstay for their series. So overall, today we're going to take a look at the Dreamcast. We're going to open one up, take a look inside at the different components, and Evan's even going to give us a full rundown at some of the more interesting parts of the Dreamcast history, things like development and lead up to launch. So without further ado, I'm going to shift it over to Evan. He's going to take us through the history of the Dreamcast.
Thanks, John. I'll take it from here, see if I can't fill in the gaps for some of the people out there. It starts with a man named Bernie Stolar. He took over as CEO after the Saturn. He was actually a former employee over at Sony. Now, he was taking over for Tom Kalinske. Kalinske oversaw the production of the Sega Saturn, and at the time he was trying to push the Japanese branch of Sega to not really take the path that they had decided with the Saturn, since they had forgone deals that would have secured them similar hardware to what the PlayStation and the N64 were using. They went with a setup that developers found a little more difficult to make games for. So with the new CEO in place and a new vision for the company, they went ahead with a new project. To start this up, two teams were formed. The American team was headed up by Tatsuya Yamamoto, a former employee of IBM, who began development using the 3DFX Voodoo chipset. It was a chipset that completely changed the PC gaming market. The Japanese team was led by a designer from the Sega Genesis era, Hideki Sato, who began development using NEC's Power VR as well as some parts from Hitachi. By the end of this development duel, it was the Japanese team who won out. So work began on a product that actually ended up being more powerful than the Model 3 arcade hardware, which at the time was some of the best in use. This led to Sega releasing something known as the Naomi board. It was a type of arcade cabinet motherboard. It was considered pretty affordable, and because the games were actually loaded into the RAM instead of a drive, the lifetime of the system was a lot greater than its predecessors. The release of this board was a great leg up for Sega, and it also served at its core as the parts for the Dreamcast. To make it more accessible for home purchases, they did have to cut down a little bit on the power. The Dreamcast had half as much system and video memory, and only a quarter of the Naomi's sound memory. But still, the core parts were very similar. And in planning for the home release of this console, Stolar decided that he wanted this to be the first console to have a built-in modem. Many of the Sega executives didn't really like this, but Stolar did see that the future of gaming was online. And with what we know now, he wasn't wrong. It was around this time that Yuji Naka actually won back the rights to Sega's big mascot. Sonic the Hedgehog was back in Sega's hands, and they began work on giving Sonic a title that would be worthy as a rival to Mario 64. Sega also wanted to focus on bigger, ambitious titles for the release. They looked towards Yu Suzuki for a game that he was working on that we now know as Shenmue, and they had him move production towards focusing on the Dreamcast. It was in 1998 when the system first launched in Japan. The problem at this point was that the NEC chipset was in short supply. This greatly limited the amount of consoles they could sell on day one. It also didn't help that the release games weren't all that great. Virtua Fighter wasn't as good as the one in the arcade, and games like Godzilla Generations and Pen Pen Tri-Icelon were both pretty well eviscerated by critics at the time. Sonic Adventure did thankfully drop closer to Christmas, but by this time most gamers were looking to other places to try to get their fix. It wasn't until that following summer when a game would be released that was considered a must-own. The infamous Pseudo Life Sim by Yuichi Saito, known only as Seaman. I believe John's talked about this before, but at its time, this game was pretty unique, and because it was complete absurdity, it blew up in Japan. This put some life back into the system before its American release, which happened only 2 months later. The success of this game served to ease some of the investor stress, seeing as how Sega reported losses of around $378 million at this time, since that was able to be viewed as an investment into the future. The problem at this point was that Sega needed to gather the best games they could have for the US release. Up until now, Sega was the go-to system for sports fanatics. But in an almost sad kind of irony, Stolar, the now CEO for the Dreamcast release, was faced with finding titles to fill the need while having been the architect during his time at Sony for securing a deal that would link EA to Sony for quite some time. So Sega reached out to a company known as Visual Concepts. Prior to this, EA had actually contracted Visual Concepts to create a game. Sadly, this was cancelled, but they were still really wanting to release something. So Sega tossed them $10 million in order to secure some new titles, something to rival the now massive Madden IP. Sega also reached out to EA, but their demands were a little too steep. Specifically, they wanted exclusive rights to develop sports games on the Dreamcast. When Sega refused, EA took it as a kind of insult and vowed to crush Sega's new console. Though the loss of the Madden titles was a pretty big blow in the American markets, looking back, both fans and critics agree that in the time, the NFL 2K title was superior to Madden. Sadly, the name just didn't carry as much clout. But Sega still pushed to round out the Dreamcast titles. They picked up a Mortal Kombat, Hydro Thunder, NFL Blitz. From Capcom, they picked up a title known as Power Stone, which was actually in development for the Naomi boards. Namco was a little wary at handing over Tekken, which had done so well on the PlayStation, so instead they threw them Soul Calibur. This was pretty amazing because the Dreamcast release of Soul Calibur skyrocketed it to become one of the banner titles for Namco. And all these games were of course topped off with Sonic Adventures. With the game lineup set, all Sega had to do was dump $100 million into some advertisements and then wait for the release date. 9/9/99. The console and about 17 titles would launch right alongside it. It was in this moment when Stolar, a person who kind of became a little hated in the Sega industry, with both fans and executives, decided to leave it to Peter Moore, his vice president, to take the role of the voice of Sega. Eventually Moore would take over as CEO, but for now, he had one message. All is well, Sega isn't desperate, there's a new system, and everyone's gonna love it. This message saw a release day that shattered prior records for video game console sales. And not just that, but any entertainment media sales on release day. Not bad at all. It was at this point that Sega decided in its move forward it needed to stay very unique. Creativity became king, and to achieve this, Sega actually took its in-house development companies and separated them. They became sort of their own entities and began churning out titles we've never seen before. Dreamcast became the home for games like Space Channel 5, Rez, which, although not released in the US, became an inspiration for other games that decided to use music as a core part to the overall gaming experience. Crazy Taxi 1 and 2, Virtua Tennis, Confidential Mission, Typing of the Dead, Jet Set Radio, 100 Swords, Skies of Arcadia, Shenmue 1 and 2, Propeller Arena, Choo Choo Rocket, Samba de Amigo, and Phantasy Star Online, only to name a few. This all sort of came to a head in a game called Segagaga, which was a weird, almost artsy look at the end of the Dreamcast's life, because despite all this, there was a festering amount of cost underneath Sega's image. Costs, even from back in the Genesis era, were beginning to stack up, and after the release of the PS2, Sega found themselves taking a massive hit in the production versus price department. This put all the strain on the game developers to support the console, and with the advent of CDR discs and the discovery that the Dreamcast could read them just fine, rampant piracy saw to it that the Dreamcast would be finished and Sega would be on life support. And it didn't help that the PS2 supported DVD media. On launch day, the PS2 showed Sega what real record-setting numbers were, even with a serious shortage of consoles. And in 2001, the transition for Sega to become a third-party company began. It was around this time that Isao Okawa, a core investor in Sega since the 70s, released Sega of its debt to him. This allowed them to continue on with their plans to become a third-party company. They did claim they were going to support the Dreamcast for as long as they could, but with the release of NHL 2K2, it was the last that they were able to put into it. In a weird twist though, the Japanese market, which initially really didn't care much for the Dreamcast, kept it going, specifically with the shoot-'em-up genre. Games trickled to the Dreamcast even up through 2014 with the release of Redux, Dark Matters. And in the end, the Dreamcast was able to claim that it had the most first-party titles, even when compared to the GameCube or the Xbox. And this was only in its short 4 years on the market, 3 if you only want to count the launch in the US and beyond. And that, in so many words, was the life of the ahead-of-its-time Dreamcast. Thanks, John. Back to you.
Thanks, Evan, for the quick look back at the history of the Dreamcast. From here, we're going to go ahead and open up the system. Of course, the Dreamcast came with the 56K modem, something that really set it apart from the competition at the time, considering it was the first game console to really launch with a modem attached to it. Only a couple of Phillips head screws keeps the top together, so once you get those out, it comes right off, which is pretty nice if you're looking to clean your Dreamcast. Really not a lot of work to get the top off. Here's a quick tip: if your buttons get kind of sticky on either side, whether it's due to, I don't know, dirt or syrup or who knows, you can actually clean them just by taking the button out. There's two tabs on the underside, you pop them up, and then you can take the whole button out, and in that case you can either soak it in like soap and water, or you can just clean it with a Q-tip and alcohol, and it'll make it click down like new. Alright, let's take a look inside the Dreamcast here. On the left you see this power supply. It looks very similar to the Sega Saturn power supply, believe it or not, which is kind of interesting to me when I first saw it. Dead center here, of course, we have the full disk drive assembly that includes the laser and the motorized arm that moves back and forth. Let's say your Dreamcast randomly stops reading, you would have to replace this portion along with the laser to get it to work again. A couple of screws and a plug keep the power supply together. Now I have seen some cases where the Dreamcast won't power on, and generally it ends up being either the power button, much like how the Sega Saturn had issues with, or this full power supply unit needs to be replaced. Fortunately, it's not difficult to get to. Just be very careful when you're touching it because, as you can see, several components along with capacitors are exposed and can give you a good zap if you're not careful. Here's that power button I was talking about, also very easy to get to, and only a couple screws hold it in. That does run around to the power supply, and that's how it cuts it on and off. Next up is the board that controls all 4 controller slots along with the internal battery. The internal battery is kind of interesting on the Dreamcast because unlike other batteries, this one is actually rechargeable. In fact, a lot of people report that just by leaving their Dreamcast on, it will recharge their battery. Now, of course, if the battery is too old, it cannot hold a charge any longer, but it actually has 3 posts that connect to the board, one for recharging, the other 2 for straight power. Kind of an interesting concept at the time, another thing that really set the Dreamcast apart from other systems. And here's our tiny little fan that keeps the system cool. Now, you may be confused as to why it doesn't seem to be pointing to anything. It does have a fan shroud going out, so it pulls air out. And you might be looking at this thinking, well, there's no heatsink that it's cooling. That's where things get interesting. We'll run over that in a second here, but for the most part, the fan just comes out with a couple screws. If you need to replace it, easy enough to do, not difficult at all. Here's a quick look at the underside of the laser assembly along with the motorized arm that moves it back and forth. You can see it is connected with a ribbon cable, but what's really nice here is the entire board that it sits on top of is actually modular. After removing a few screws, you can see the entire thing pops right off. I like the Dreamcast for this fact that a lot of these boards are modular, so if something goes wrong with one, you don't have to worry about the entire board being shot. You can actually just change boards out as you need them. For example, we showed you the controller board. Maybe some of your controller ports stop working, bam, replace it and you're good to go. Now, we talked very briefly about how that fan wasn't cooling any obvious heatsink, and that's where things get interesting because, see, that entire metal plate we've been looking at this whole time is the heatsink. It actually uses both sides of that plate. There's one underneath and one above, along with, you'll see here, thermal pads, and it actually disperses heat that way, uses the fan to keep the internal temperature of the entire system at a reasonable temperature. Cool idea. I believe the N64 used the similar method, just more passively without a fan. Alright, let's rip this top piece of metal away, and that'll show us underneath how they disperse the heat from the chips themselves. Nice big chunk of aluminum, very old school here, I like that. And this is a great way to keep the heat down inside the system, remove it from the chips using that with thermal pads. Good idea overall, helps keep it nice and thin, and of course that fan will help to keep the top chunk of that metal cool. Alright, let's take a quick look around the board and at some of the chips. The first chip we have here is the Power VR2 graphics processor. It's clocked at 100 megahertz. Directly to its left is the RISC processor from Hitachi, clocked at 200 megahertz. So essentially the RISC processor is most of the CPU, and the Power VR is like the GPU for the system. Now, they seem to put RAM modules all over the motherboard. The Dreamcast itself has 16 megabytes of main RAM along with an additional 8 megabytes of RAM for graphic textures, and then it has 2 megabytes of RAM for sound. Altogether, the system itself is pretty powerful at the time, clocking it at 1.4 gigaflops. I know we like to measure in teraflops now, but 1.4 gigaflops is where this one clocked in with a 128-bit graphics-oriented floating point. Despite Sega estimating that the Dreamcast was theoretically capable of rendering 7 million raw polygons per second, in actuality it ended up being more around 3 million polygons per second. They noted that things like game logic and physics reduce peak graphic performance. And that's it for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed a look back at the Dreamcast, both from a hardware perspective and kind of a history perspective. We had a lot of fun doing the video, and I do like the Dreamcast a lot. It was a system I really enjoyed back when it came out. Some of my favorite games, of course, being things like Marvel vs. Capcom 2, and strangely, I enjoyed playing Virtua Tennis and Power Stone as well. A lot of cool games back then. good system overall. It really does deserve being looked back on as I guess you'd say, an internet legend with a lot of people who enjoyed the retro games. But thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you guys in the next video.